Hello there, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube, the internet, and the like, and welcome back to Team Fortress 2, where today we are going to be playing as the Psychomaniac using the degreaser, the flare gun, and the power jack, which normally would have been replaced by the extinguisher had it not been nerfed, but that's not really going to be the topic of this video. That's definitely a weapon I probably should play with at some point, but first things first, I think it's important to point out that since I don't really play too much Pyro, and that I've been trying to get into the habit of actually giving him a little bit more love in my TF2 playstyle, I think it's safe to say that this is a pretty good start where we just kind of go over the basics of Pyro and how he mostly works in the typical pub fashion, I guess you could say. A lot of pub pyros, there are plenty varying amounts, like most other TF2 classes. I mean, you'll occasionally see a flog pyro, but most commonly you'll see backburners and regular flamethrowers. And most of the time, there's also going to be the degreaser pyros, the pyros who generally have a little bit more game sense, and they know what the capabilities are of the degreaser and what its purpose is. The degreaser itself is not really that much of a killing weapon. It obviously has the potential with the flames, but the flame afterburn itself does in fact deal less damage than other flamethrowers. Possibly a little bit less than the Phlogistonator's flames, but that could be easily disproved by someone who actually uses a source like a wiki to look this sort of stuff up, but what am I to say? I'm sure somebody will eventually remind me in the future. Also got the flare gun on. I think the flare gun is probably the most handy unlockable for the Pyro. A long time ago, I remember talking about which I prefer more, which is the flare gun and the shotgun, and I said I enjoyed the shotgun more. However, I think that's much more liable to change nowadays. I mean, the flare gun obviously is utter crap against other pyros, unless you somehow manage to get a really quick weapon switch and land a critical flare, which is indeed possible. I have seen it before, but it is excessively difficult and requires really strict timing and possibly a really strict angle to pull it off. I'm sure eventually somebody else could show me. I know my good friend Mr. Bones, who plays a lot of Pyro, has the ability to occasionally do that, as we've tried before, so it's a pretty good skill to have. Overall, I'd say the flare gun is definitely the best unlockable. The shotgun was made more in mind for more Pyro versus Pyro battles, although typically on pubs, in an ideal world, that's definitely what you'd be seeing, but instead, most pyros just run at each other with the flames, and then it's kind of a contest to see who burns out first without the effects of afterburn, so there is that to consider. And as you can see, going by the gameplay so far, I'm running out with the power jack, and we're getting crushed. After having a foot race with this demo man right here, I somehow get stair-stabbed, courtesy of possibly a little bit of lag. At the moment when that actually occurred, I know the demo file that I recorded speaks for itself, but it didn't really look like that spy was anywhere close to my head. I thought I got backstabbed by a second spy now that I think about it, because there are a number of spies that attempt to assault all the engineers on our team. All three of them, I should probably note, but I'm sure that will come when it comes. But for now, we're actually just making an effort to make sure none of the rest of the blue team can actually penetrate our defenses, getting a few reflex on the soldier's black box right here. Practicing reflecting is one of the most important assets of the Pyro, and typically it's really easy for the basic rocket launchers. For rockets that have a little bit of faster travel speed, like the Liberty launcher or the direct hit, obviously it requires a little bit of stricter timing, but it's certainly not impossible. It just, again, you kinda have to be a little bit precise with those mouse clicks, but typically, Pyro is a really good counter to not only spies, but soldiers who aren't using shotguns, or even demo men for that matter, demo men that aren't particularly using sticky bomb launchers. Sticky bombs are generally a lot more difficult to reflect because the demo man has 8 in his clip. You can reflect as many times as you like, but I think the demo man at the least has a higher firing rate, and chances are the sticky bombs aren't really going to be brushed back a little bit far, not as far as you'd actually like them to, so there is that to consider. So now we are finally pushed at the last point, which by finally I mean it only took about 4 minutes. Obviously, the blue team has kind of had it out for us this entire time, but this is actually a fairly good spot for the Pyro, because I'm just down in this pit where engineers tend to turtle about, you know, These engineers were a bit more particularly smart with their sentry placements. They used the typical ones that are usually expected to work or get destroyed really easily, but it works out for me because I'm able to sort of make this grand rounds around each individual nest and ensure that no pesky spy is going to be at them. I can protect them from various angles, but again, it's kind of difficult because the blue team tends to have the high ground. I get a little bit overconfident right here, and I don't pay attention to this engineer, who is actually the source of building the mini-sentries which I was trying to shoot, which definitely wasn't the smartest idea. Now, you've probably already noticed there is a third sentry. There's actually a sniper that's attempting to shoot at it right now. The benefits of having that sentry in the map room are that it actually covers just outside of the window, possibly a little bit down where the cart is when it moves closer towards the final point, and it does happen to cover the upper deck. However, there are some extreme downsides. For one thing, there's that area with a little bit of a higher ledge far to the right, just past that window now I think about it, where most people could just spam it out, like that sniper you saw earlier. And even then, if an enemy soldier or an enemy pyro were to just take the route into the map room, they'd be able to very easily just spam that sentry out in almost no time at all, thanks to corners. And since sentries tend to be distracted from opposite angles, like outside of that window, anyone could just run in and almost destroy it and the engineer easily. It's not the most recommended spot, but hey, at least it was there for some time. The only biggest problem here was that I was not able to help that engineer as often as I would have loved to, because that spot in the map room is mostly outside of my reach. Since I'm going to be down in the pit trying to protect the cart area along with the other two engineers, I can't exactly jump my way up there. I can't do a super jump. Even with the detonator, I doubt I could reach that height unless I were bouncing off of the cart, and even then, that's still questionable, and that's something I'd probably have to test at some point. So this engineer's stuff does go down, but he does persistently attempt to build a couple of times, and the spy pretty much tends to be the bane of his existence and is constantly harassing him inside that room. I'm not sure, but I think that engineer does eventually give up, but not the other two engineers, thankfully. They at least managed to hold out defense for long enough so that way we can eventually push forward a little bit. And here's another thing that this engineer is actually doing, is that he's moving his sentry out a little bit at a time. And that basically revolves around how much ground we're actually covering. So it's really actually a pretty smart idea to move your buildings around depending on where the cart is rolling back, and if your team has a good control of this choke point. Badwater, the final point, is pretty considerably difficult to capture on blue, because it being a final point, and this being an area where just engineers always love to huddle together and build as many nests as possible to try and stop the opposition, it can be pretty difficult to push on blue, and you're going to need a lot of power classes to support that push. It is kind of noteworthy to point out that the blue team does eventually get that idea, and you will soon see, in probably a couple of minutes, how exactly that push works and how close they come to actually capturing it. It's not dangerously close, but they do get the cart back down the hill in almost no time at all, which is a little bit of risky business right there. Once again, the spies just doing their spy thing, this one disguising as me, holding out the power jack. I think he was just going for that really obvious spy approach, but I don't know, when I'm sort of patrolling this area in general, I don't really understand the point of that spy trying to do that, but, you know, whatever, you know, I don't really want to play down to his level and try to figure out what his rational decisions were and what his irrational ones were, of course. You know, whatever. Actually, I think the last time I ever played as a pyro was back when I was actually just using the regular flamethrower, and I had talked about how I don't think either one is superior to the other. Typically, most stock weapons do have a habit of being better than any unlockable. I think the Degreaser is a slight exception because you're able to at least pair it up with something like the flare gun, or any melee weapon that gives you the ability to, at the least in random pubs, like pubs, just get that lucky critical hit that you wouldn't expect in a competitive gameplay sense. I think the Degreaser is just a bit more handy in many different ways. You get the faster weapon switch, you get the ability to crit combo people and single them out a lot more reliably than you would with any other flamethrower. Most other flamethrowers kind of expect you to sort of utilize the flames and the air blast sort of a bit more conservingly. I think with the Degreaser you can be a hell of a lot more reckless, and you could just say, oh, well, you're going to run up to me and try to spam a rocket, I'm going to quickly reflect that rocket, puff you up in flames, and then possibly I might consider puffing you up into the air, you know, air blasting you right up there so that way you stay and all your hairs are stacked up on your head, you know, shoot another flare on you, that will cause you to take 90 damage. Like I said, it's pretty reckless, the things you can probably do with the Degreaser, and sometimes I kind of overestimate my abilities of a pyro, which tends to get me killed, and it kind of shows the weakness of how the Degreaser tends to do a little less damage, but, you know, I think it all works out in the end. With other combos in mind, I suppose I could try using something like a shotgun, or possibly the detonator, a few different options that are definitely available to the pyro. Just, I'm mostly comfortable with using the flare gun because of that guaranteed crit. One thing that actually confuses me about the flare gun, I'm gonna quickly go over this, is that I didn't really know that well that it does have the ability to randomly crit, which doesn't make any sense at all. It already deals guaranteed crits on people who are set ablaze, and the only people who are able to be immune to fire, or the effects of Afterburn, I guess I could say, are Charge and Targe Demo Knights, and of course other pyros. I don't understand why it needs to random crit, but then again, maybe it's just kind of negligible to complain about due to the fact that the flare gun and likewise the shotgun don't tend to crit as often as most other weapons do. I'd say the pyro's main crit source is definitely from his melee weapons when it comes to random crits, but even then, if I were playing in a place that was not a random pub game, if I were playing on a no-crit server, then chances are it would definitely be at its highest balance, but then again, there'd be a lot of people who definitely knew what they were doing, and sometimes it's kind of fun to just go pub and play with people who just want to have a good time and don't really care that much about what happens in the game. Like the Spy, I'm not really sure why he tried to shoot me in a room, or generally an area that was filled with a bunch of sentry guns already, so removing his mask potentially would kill him really easily, but who am I to judge? He was probably just doing what he wanted to, and I obviously cannot argue with that. Now this is actually around the point, right after the sentry gun actually gets moved up by this engineer who's just finishing leveling it up. This is where the blue team actually starts successfully initiating their giant push, which I believe has a medic, a heavy, a soldier, and a demo, and possibly a pyro and a scout. There's just a whole bunch of flavors of different classes right here, and I'm trying to air blast them away, but of course, I get sticky right in the face. This demo man right here uses the sticky bomb launcher to very good use. He effectively takes out both of the sentry nests, and with this much time left on the clock, it's crunch time. We're in a bit of a panic. We have to at least defend this area before they could successfully finish off all the hard work we've put on. And here's an example of me just going entirely reckless. So somehow I don't die, but I just miss my shave with death right here. You know, only about 30 health left, and I'm just standing around this corner, getting 1 kill, 1 assist, defending the cart, finishing off this demo right here, and almost running back to spawn, but thankfully, Based Medic is our savior. So, thank you, Based Medic. Thank you for your services to mankind. And because they wasted all of the team's resources on that push, we're actually able to storm around the area of the third point, where we could potentially take control. However, I run straight back to the cart to ensure that nobody attempts to make any sort of devious back cap. And this is actually going to end the round off, and somehow I managed to top score, possibly because you get extra points for air blasting fellow players when they're on fire and stuff like that. I don't know what constitutes why the pyro gets extra points for this sort of stuff, but, you know, I guess that's kind of just what makes him one of the best classes in the game. Definitely one of the most handy ones. And this is going to wrap up the commentary as well, so thank you guys very much for watching, have a great day or evening, and I guess I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.